Hello and welcome to the second podcast of SSPDA Student Chapter. I am your host, Nick Kapp. I am the Student Club Advisor for the West Coast Chapter, Student Chapter of the PDA. Maria de Aguilar is our Student Chapter President and Editor of this particular podcast. I am bringing you a series of podcasts that are roughly about 10 to 15 minutes long, a short topic for the beginning student of biotechnology, life sciences, and drug development and discovery. What we intend to do is to inform and educate a new generation of pharma manufacturers through a discussion of helpful links, stories, and interviews. So we are evolving this. So please help us help you. In the coming weeks, we will be trying out various ways to inform our listeners to what it takes to work in the pharma manufacturing sphere. And so we're just giving you information. While we will talk about many ways to support you, the biopharma listener, we are committed, like the PDA, to connecting people, science, and the regulation. So this is what we're really kind of focusing on. This week, what I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about what a podcast is and kind of how you can use them. And so a lot of times we're thinking that we just kind of do stuff and we learn all of our information in class. But the reality is what classes are doing is giving you this kind of base knowledge of information, and you need to go out and use it. Okay, how you use it is by listening to people in your industry kind of talk. And so what I would like to do, what I'd like to suggest for people are to use podcast. And so a podcast is an episodic series of spoken word digital audio files that a user can download in a personal device for easy listening. I like that, easy listening. Streaming applications and podcasting services provide a convenient, integrated way to manage a personal consumption queue across many podcast sources and playback devices. This oddly enough, is a podcast on podcast that you may want to subscribe to. And so I will talk about those. But again, it's a way for you to kind of use materials that you're doing in class. You got to use them out of class. And so that's the big connect. A lot of people, when they first go to a company, they learned all this stuff in school, but they don't know how to interact with it, or they don't know it in context. So that's what you really need to develop. And so listening to podcasts, listening to professionals in your field to talk about what's going on is fun. And so I want to give you some basic ideas about podcast. It's the host and it's the science. And so what we tend to look a lot at podcast is there's going to be somebody talking in the podcast, or somebody that you can see in the podcast. Some hosts will talk and you get to know them, and that kind of gets you interested in a podcast. Some hosts just introduce the subject and put it in there, and they're not there. Some just kind of read a paper. It's kind of hard. They're just sitting there reading a paper. Some develop these kind of long, complicated stories that are kind of interesting and fun to listen to. Some have basic parts, and so there's usually an introduction. Like I did today, I introduced kind of what our podcast. Some have the story. Some talk about recent papers, and then usually they all have a closing statement. Kind of listen to our podcast, give us some money, all those kind of things. Support our group. It really depends on what you want. You can listen to the type of podcast that you want. There's a number of services that we could look at podcasts, and so I look at Stitcher, I look at Google Podcasts. So I have some of these, and this is the ID for Google Podcast. Microbrev TV is the ASM one. They list what they're doing. That's good. When we look at these, it's a way to support our favorite podcast. You may also have show notes and links to the items that are mentioned in there, and you also have video like this one here. I don't know why you'd want to watch a video of my head doing this, but that's really kind of interesting. Fun biology podcasts that I think you should listen to are things like TWIBS. This is the TW this week in virology. This is number 631. They typically do this one or twice a week, and they try and give a snappy name to this. Lots of eggs in the spike basket. In this one, we have Rich and Raccaniello, Rich Condent, Brianne Barker, who you kind of get to know over a while on this. And these are kind of interesting hosts, and they'll do a lot of things like started out like, what's the weather here where you're at? And so they're in Boston, they're in Texas, they're in various parts of the world. And in this week in virology, what's really kind of interesting, it's gotten really hot. A lot of people kind of look at this because they started to talk about COVID now. And so when I say 1 or 2 weeks, 1 or 2 shows a week, what they try and do is have one show just on viruses and then one show on something that's dealing with kind of COVID. And so it's really, really kind of interesting. And I think you should go and see it. And I really like the way that Vincent kind of talks. It's easily listening. It's really fun for beginners. This is a really kind of good one. Now, this is a different podcast that I have here. We call it The Bacterial Files. In this show, again, what we tend to see is when shows have been around for a lot, I think the host like to kind of start giving it some different names. And this one's here is Paired Predators Prevent Pathogen Persistence. In this episode, a bacteriophage and bacterial predator can wipe out a population of bacteria that could develop resistance to each individually. And so again, when we're looking at the development of drugs and kind of stuff like that and antibiotic resistance, which is a really big problem that we have, how can we get rid of it? So what we want to do is we want to develop a new drug, a magic bullet that would kill the bacteria. But trouble is, bacteria are smart and they become resistant to it. And so what they're seeing here is that can we use bacteriophage, which are viruses that infect bacteria, and a bacterial predator, which is usually a larger multicellular eukaryote that can affect this. This is Jesse Noir, who has rapid fire delivery, talks really fast. It's a really good workout when you're running and stuff like that because he's really kind of talking fast. These are short. These tend to be 10-15 minutes they do. But again, you may need to do some reading in order to catch up on it. And this is kind of one of those things. And again, in all these things, what I'm going to do is you're going to listen to things and you're going to go, what is that? The great thing is you have this internet resource. Go through and look at the internet and look at things. Outsourced Pharma has 2 sets of podcasts that I think are really interesting. OutsourcingPharma.com is they're kind of looking at the business of biotech. Let me go back here a little bit. And business of biotech has about 100 episodes. The last episode was from 2018, and so they're starting to be a little bit dated on there. A new series of talks are called Pharmamanufacturing.com. This is sponsored by Thermo Fisher, and it talks mainly about the business. How do you hire workers for this? How do you revamp your factory, etc.? And so they're kind of really interesting things that go on here. Again, Bioprocess Online, Matthew Pilar, who's an editor for Bioprocess Online, hosts an interview. This is kind of really dense material. It's kind of really slow. You want to think about it. So if you're driving and it's not too hazardous, or if you're walking and being careful and stuff like that, the show notes for this are available. And this is the business of biotech, and it's an interesting talk. Kind of a thing that we look at is the FDA. Tends to not put out a lot of stuff, but it looks like they do have these monthly updates for safety issues with the FDA. It's very dense material. You may need to look a lot of things up. It's monthly, and it's currently talking about kind of things in the news. And so, again, the safety issues with the latest COVID drug regimens will kind of come out. And so this is the FDA Drug Safety Podcast, and it's kind of interesting to listen to. Another podcast that I found that's kind of related to the life sciences and industry is called Phase One. It's an IPS podcast. IPS is a company that kind of consults with a lot of biopharmaceuticals, and so they're talking a little bit about business and regulation. And what they do is they provide an upbeat take on career and industry insights for the life industry. And so they have somebody who's kind of snappy, kind of talks about it. These have new podcasts on business issues concerning the life science industry, and we tend to see these happening about once a month. Look at it. The PDA itself has a number of podcasts. Hopefully they'll put this podcast in there. But under the PDA letters, which is basically a journal, they put out podcasts. They're pretty intermittent. They have some old podcasts, and every once in a while they'll come up with a new podcast. And basically it's kind of somebody describing a paper or a technical report, which is one of the things that we like to do. But again, it can be hard to concentrate on these, and so you may want to look at that. The last podcast I believe that we're going to look at is this drug discovery world. I like this Giles. I don't know what his last name is. He has this wonderful English accent. It's nice. He's relatively fast. He reads an article from the journal, so it's really kind of intense material. It's a lot of information. It's very fast, and you're going to need to look a lot of things up. But it's very informative, and it's very specialized. And so I think it's one of those things that we need to kind of look at. Again, with all our podcasts, we're going to have an ending statement. So it's thank you for taking part in our podcast. If you have any comments or ideas or questions, please email me directly at Kapp, K-A-P-P, at smccd.edu. That's the college that I work at. It's been nice talking to you. Again, one of the things that you want to listen to the podcast, it's something that you need to do outside of the classroom in order to understand. You're going to go into this industry. And again, a lot of times we don't know what we're going into. And, a lot of us may think, hey, I want to discover a cure for cancer. I want to discover cures for Alzheimer. And yes, that's going to happen. One person's going to happen. One person wins the lottery. One person wins the gold in the marathon for the Olympics. Everyone else has to be there in order to support it. Again, that marathon runner is not going to be able to run that without everyone else who's in that race and everyone else who took parts in races kind of going on there. And so it's really critical that we get and we go out there and we look at it. And so you may not necessarily be thinking, hey, I want a job in regulatory. But again, somebody needs to do that job. And those jobs are out there and they pay pretty well. And so I thank you for listening to our podcast, and this is the science of biomanufacturing, and we would like to include people, regulation, and you. Thank you very much.